if Israel ceased to be expansionist, there wouldn't be any worries about a larger war in the Middle East, right? I mean, that's, again, I agree with Mearsheimer that clearly Israel is a liability. They're not an asset to the West.
Do you think the establishment currently, they don't view Israel as a liability? How do they justify this? Do you think it's blackmail, corruption?
Well, I think in some cases, I think that, I think that's probably a smaller part of it. I might be wrong. These are things that happen behind closed doors and we don't really know. But I think there's ideological commitment, and then there's a lot of money. We see it in the U.S., but it happens too in European countries. I think it's a combination of those two. There is a real ideological commitment, that many of these people are convinced Zionists. Even though they're not Jewish, they're not Christian Zionists, but still they're Zionists. It's something that they have been taught. It was part of their, let's say, culturation process and part of becoming a part of the establishment. They've adopted this viewpoint. But then there's also just plain old money. Money talks in politics.
Yeah, yeah, I do feel like the only way that maybe we can solve this problem is the dollar collapse. Do you feel like that's what maybe will end all this?
Well, it could. I certainly hope that it happens sooner. I mean, again, it can be a combination of things. I don't think it will be any one thing. I think that's what we were talking about last time.
How soon do you think we are to something like that?
That's the question that I just cannot answer. I think we've talked about that. Predicting when. You can look at trends. Whether you're talking about when are the Ukrainians going to collapse, when are their defenses going to collapse? You look at the trends and you just see that it has to happen at some point, right? Ukraine is getting weaker and weaker. Russia is stronger and stronger. At some point, there's going to be a collapse. But when that is, it's just very hard to predict. And it's the same thing with economic questions and questions of legitimacy. I think we look at it, all the trends are now going against the Western hegemonic Zionist establishment. They're going against them. It just and they're not just in one dimension, but again, militarily, economically, and also in terms of soft power, and all those things are taking us to that day, when it will collapse. But I just don't know when.
Do you think that this current trade war we're engaged in with China could potentially lead to a very rapid collapse that maybe people aren't really forecasting? Because it sounds like China is not going to play ball with the United States. And if they, hold on to restrictions of rare earths, just that in itself could just make the United States dead in the water. We talked about 40% of growth in the United States has been linked to the AI industry, which is reliant on these rare earths. Our military industrial complex relied on the rare earth, telecommunications, just everything. Basically, right. It's crucial. So that in itself, or if Trump goes with this 100% tariffs, if he wants to do that self-inflicted wound, that right. in it could just cause rapid inflation here, and then inflation starts to go up. We try to raise interest rates to try to stem the inflation rate. Then our debt, when it rolls over, goes at a higher rate, and then all of a sudden we start to spiral out of control.
Right. Well, I think I saw, for example, that recently, like I guess for this last fiscal year, 2/3 of deficit spending just went to paying the interest. And we're talking about $1.8 trillion, a huge amount. That's a huge deficit. And 2/3 of that is just the debt. So, you have a deficit, that means that that debt is increasing. We're clearly on an unsustainable course. This is a vicious cycle. And, the tariffs and the trade wars, obviously that's just going to contribute to the strains on our economy. There's no question about it. Again, it could be, like I say, it's very hard I think it's impossible to predict, what is the particular straw that will break the camel's back. But we see we're on an unsustainable course. There's no question about it.
Do you think China kind of smells blood in the water with the United States? And it might be it's like, okay, well, this is the time. We got to move this into a multipolar world. Maybe this is the safest, quickest way to do it. Because every single time that U.S. has tried to be tough with China, China just comes back and says, no, we're not doing this immediately. Yeah. It's different than with Russia or any other country. Because I think China knows that it has the ability to bring the U.S. to its knees. It has the leverage. The U.S. doesn't.
Yeah, well, they seem to, reach that conclusion, and I'm sure that they're right. One thing they could do, I guess they've begun this process, the process of, of selling off U.S. bonds. And I don't know how far they still hold a substantial amount, but much less than they did just even a few years ago. And that's part of, by holding all those U.S. bonds, they were helping to support the U.S. economy, support the dollar. And it seems like they have made the decision that to end this, they're not going to make that effort to support the dollar. And I think they've decided that they can do without the U.S. And we've seen that, recently that there was recently some statistics came out of China that, trade with the U.S. has declined significantly, especially in the first half of this year, obviously because of the trade war. Yet the Chinese economy grew significantly, and overall its trade increased because, though its trade with the U.S. decreased significantly, the increases in trade with like Southeast Asia and other parts of the world more than made up for that loss. And I think just there you can see that there was a time when they couldn't do it without the U.S. And there was a time when they didn't dare to openly define the U.S. That wasn't actually that far distant in the past. But that time has passed. It's a different world, and it seems like Trump, and not just him, Secretary Bessent and others just don't understand this, that it's really over, that we have entered this multipolar world, and you just need to actually recognize that and adjust your policies accordingly.
Right. What's next for the trade war, do you see? I mean, November 1st, I doubt that these tariffs are going to affect. Isn't there some big meeting that's going to be happening, and they're going to discuss everything from Taiwan to trade and something like this?
Okay, I think Trump is hoping to meet with Xi Jinping, maybe at the APEC meeting in South Korea, if I remember correctly, and to bring this up. So we could see there's a potential, but the U.S. would really have to give up something significant for China to, maybe relax somewhat its restrictions on rare earths. I think that they're going to play hardball, and it's not just going to. It has to be, the U.S. will have to walk back a lot of these hostile actions they've taken over the last few months and maybe the last few years. I don't know that Trump could do that, but he just might be forced to. We'll see.
But my dream is that, that Trump talks with Putin, talks with Xi Jinping, and they come to this conclusion. They convince Trump, look, we don't want to rule the world the way that you're ruling it. You have a lot of problems. We can help you with those problems, but you got to stop with all this, and bombing countries, trade wars, all this hostile behavior, pull back all these military bases, take care of your own country, your own region, and we can help you develop, and we can engage in positive trade. There's no reason to have this type of relationship, but it just seems like it's the way that the U.S. has been structured ever since World War II. It won't allow for that unwinding. It's just there's too many people suckling on the teat of this, Yeah. So what do you think? Is it possible that we could do that, or is it just going to have to? Yeah. We're going to have to just crash the dollar,
right?
Some more.
Well, you can say that in a way, we already see that we are making some adjustments. It's not so much a product of a new consciousness, an acceptance of the new reality. It's just that the new reality is actually starting to bite and is forcing changes in U.S. behavior. So, one example is again, in the Ukraine war, there's the U.S. has stopped supplying certain weapons, for example, the Patriot interceptors, because they don't have them. That's reality. A lot of it's people try to blame it on Trump. He's been brainwashed by Putin, et cetera, et cetera. But it's a very good chance that we would have seen the same thing under a Democrat administration. It's because that's the reality. Or in the case of, this trade war, it didn't last very long because the reality started to bite, and Trump was forced to retreat. And I think, if he tries 100% tariffs again, he'll be forced to retreat because that's the reality. That's what we're seeing. So it's something that, again, I don't think they're acknowledging. They don't want to acknowledge, but it's there, and they are starting to bump up against it. And, and hopefully it will lead to an awareness and a really fundamental reassessment, but I don't think we're there yet. It's just like they're simply frustrated. They don't understand. It seems like there's a lack of understanding, a refusal to understand really what's going on.
But they see it. They know it deep down in their bones. Aspects, right?
Yeah, well, I think they must. Well, they come up against it. That's in these certain areas, and they're forced to, because of that. They are forced to make these differences. In another case, again, with the Navy and the Red Sea, they had to call it off after a month. It's just like part of the problem was that, okay, we're running out of missiles, and and this is costing us a lot of money, and the technology is such now that these very poor rebel groups like the Houthis can actually, potentially take down one of our ships. So we just have to call it off. Again, you don't see any recognition of that of the larger reality. Let's just put it that way: the real shift in the geopolitical balance. But in these specific, let's say, decisions, that the administration has made, I think we're seeing, at least in these specific areas, we're seeing a recognition a forced recognition of reality. They just find they don't have any choice, and they're forced to back down.
Right. And it's very apparent to us about the limits of American power, and that really the U.S. is not the hegemon anymore. And when we look at all these different fronts, when we talk about the trade war or just talk about the military, economic situation, but have the limits to American power truly permeated the general consciousness of the West? I mean, sometimes in my own bubble, I'm like, how is this happening? But do you think, just everyday Americans and people that live in the UK or France, they understand that America is not all powerful. It cannot create reality. It can't just dictate terms anymore.
Yeah, well, I think just at the edges still. I think in general that consciousness is very much there. That belief, and that's for example, we have been talking about this very bizarre behavior on the part of the Europeans. Why don't they accept the reality? Why do they insist on continuing the fight? Why do they keep on telling Ukraine that they can win? I think they really believe it on some level. It's just hard for them to believe that they can't accept this new world. They're, and you can say, inhabitants of a previous world, and they still live there. They still live there in the 90s or the early 2000s, and they haven't just accepted that, okay, that world is gone. I think it's still a very fundamental problem, and it explains a lot of very, bad policy.
Mm-hmm. I think that the general population needs to come to that conclusion before we have any change, because then we can change. Then it makes it easier for the politicians to adopt a more humble approach, right? I think the problem is that there's still enough belief in U.S. hegemony that allows them to keep on making these mistakes, because they just have to say it again and again. And then when they bump up into reality, like you say, they do a good enough job of just spinning it as a win, saying, oh, we reached some kind of deal with China. When really, actually, you've just proven to China and the rest of the world that you don't have leverage here, that you lost this battle. But the mainstream population is not fully aware of it. But slowly, what will it take? Will it take, do you think, can we just slowly become aware and have this transition? Or do you think that it will have to be a big war or financial collapse, and then everyone's like, whoops?
Yeah, again, I guess I'll just go back to what I've said. I don't know what it'll take. I think there's clearly the trends are taking us that way. And there is maybe, again, it's a very slow recognition. In general, among, let's say the average American still doesn't understand, how much the world has changed. But there is a sense that it has changed, and their trust in their own government has gone way down. But there's still this, I think, this supreme confidence, this smugness, that exists throughout the West, that we are number one. It's I guess it's really the result of decades of peace and prosperity, during which the West clearly was number one. I mean, it was unrivaled in so many, according to so many different measures, no matter how you looked at it. But that has changed. It's just no longer true. But all those decades just kind of led to this abiding faith. It's just sort of this sense that that's who we are. That's a dangerous thing. I guess it could happen to any civilization. It's just that too much prosperity, over too long a period of time, leads you to think that, this is just sort of divinely appointed. You don't stop and ask yourself the hard questions, like, what are the policies that made us strong? What are the things that we did that were right? How can we make sure that we keep on doing those things? At some point, I think they stopped thinking that way and just start thinking, we're just, because we're Europeans or because we're Americans, that's why. No, it's not because you're Europeans. It's because you had certain policies, you had certain maybe certain behaviors, cultural characteristics or whatever, but none of these were fixed, and they can change over time. And you're not the people that your ancestors were. Your leaders are not are actually have changed their policies, but you still are left with that sense of superiority, and that's a very dangerous thing. It seems like it's clearly no longer warranted. It's time to be humble. We should have been humble in the past. That would have kept us strong. Actually, humility is is an important thing. The ability to really assess yourself critically. And we seem to have lost that.
Is the phenomena of a global hegemon, is that uniquely Western? Is that part of the reason maybe that it's difficult for us? Is that, I'm just trying to think historically, we had like the Portuguese and the British or the French, different.
The Dutch too.
The Dutch, right? Yeah. Like the Spanish, sort of different empires, but they're all unique. They're all Western. They're all European. Right. And then we are, America is a product of this. And so this concept of U.S. hegemony is something that just maybe firmly ingrained in the minds of people in the West.
Yeah, I think there's right.
Yeah, but it doesn't exist, I think, in China. So it's so strange when we try to project that onto other countries, like China or Russia or.
Yeah, well, I think it is. I think there's quite a bit of truth to that. There's the last 500 years approximately in which the world empires, such as it were, it's hard to call like the Portuguese. They colonized a good part of South America, and they established smaller colonies throughout the world, had trading posts throughout the world. They were a world power in the sense that no other country had ever been. And then, they were followed by the Spaniards and the Dutch and the British, and, each of these were great global powers. So there was this, I think, that sense of, ruling the globe is just kind of like has never completely dissipated. It's there. It's something. If 500 years of history doesn't vanish overnight, I'm sure that that does feed into the general sense of, this is our right. This is who we are. It takes a different form. You have a lot of people who are maybe avowedly anti-colonial, kind of on the left within the West. Yet they do still have this sense that we rule the world. They want to rule it in their own way, make sure that that basically Western liberal culture is affirmed and celebrated around the world. There's expectation, not a real tolerance for other ways, more traditional ways. But it's there, and I think you're right. You just don't find it anywhere else. The Russians have no desire to rule the whole world and to impose the Russian way of life and make everybody, like a member of the Russian Orthodox Church or anything like that. And the same thing goes for the Chinese. It is something that's left out. It is a product. It's a very complicated question. I think there are many streams that feed into it, and I think one of those streams probably is that 500-year history of Western global domination.
If we have this global hegemonic mindset, and it's because of 500 years of history in the West, is that something you can change and learn? How do we solve that problem? Is it education? I mean, but the thing is, most people, I feel, realize that, colonialism was bad, that we shouldn't have gone over there and we created a lot of bad things. I'm sure there were some good things as well. I mean, you grew up you were born in a colony in Uganda, right? So
right. Yeah, it was a colony at the time of my birth, and then it shortly thereafter gained its independence. And in general, people actually had a positive attitude towards England. There wasn't a lot of anger at the colonialists there. It's in some places, they actually did pretty well. They weren't there just to oppress the population. Others, there are horror stories. It's a complicated picture. I think at this point, there is, the anti-colonial position is the default position within the West. But there is still in a kind of a supremacist mindset. It's just taking a new form.
Sometimes when we talk about with China and Russia, and I'm wondering what about our behavior. There's always comments people say, well, we're dancing around the obvious answer, which is it's just racism. Do you think that's a big part of it? That there's just we just think that the Western elites just believe we're white and then that way we just know we're just better. Is that do you think a big part of where the superiority stems from?
I think maybe in some cases, but in general, I'll say no. And just look at the hatred of Russia. For example, in Western Europe, the hatred of Russia and Russians, the absolute lack of interest in the obvious targeted intentional killing of Russian civilians or Russian-speaking civilians, within eastern Ukraine. And then earlier there was the hatred of Serbs. It seems like it's very, very easy for them to hate white people when it serves their interests. It may be, I think perhaps in the case of Palestine, there is some of that. It's sort of especially when you find somebody, you kind of wonder, like somebody like Witkoff, who seems to be okay with the Russians, but he doesn't mind when Palestinians are killed. Maybe there is some sort of residual racism there. And maybe that's what explains part of the reason why, Israeli lives are valued so much more, whereas Palestinian, Lebanese lives aren't valued really at all. I wouldn't say that, it's hard to say, because you don't know what's going on deep within somebody's heart. But I suspect there's maybe a bit of racism there. But it's not it's not just a general cause, I think, because again, you look at it, so many of the people that have been demonized are white. So that's not racism. I mean, I guess you could call it, they're Slavs, they're a different kind of people, but they are white.
Right. Well, I think maybe when it comes to Muslims, Palestinians, or just Arabs in general, it seems like this racism wasn't organic. This was something that was, coordinated, that was intentional, right? Largely from Israel and the Israeli lobby people, right? To create this idea that they're all terrorists and they're bad people. I mean, especially ever since 9/11, that was clearly the agenda, and it was just the life where I grew up. It was the idea, the bad guys are Arabs. Right. That was what was being told to us, and so that's not organic. That type of response.
Exactly. So. I mean, it does precede 9/11. It was there, but it did receive a boost after 9/11.
It was always there, do you think, in part because of Israel? If Israel was never created as a state, then there would never have been any of this idea that somehow, the Muslims are bad people or they're terrorists or they're antithetical to Christianity. But I think what a lot of people are finding, though, is as they go down this, they realize, like, I saw, a new subway station open up in Tehran, and it was dedicated to the Virgin Mary. And it has such, because she's a holy figure in Islam as well. And people are realizing, like, oh, wait, these guys love Jesus too as a prophet. There's actually more overlap between Islam and Christianity than there is between this whole Judeo-Christian concept, because, Judaism is essentially rejecting Christ.
I can't hear you. You froze.
You can't hear me? Okay.
Okay, now you're back.
I can still hear you. Okay, I can still hear you. Yeah. But yeah, I was just saying, right. I think you heard.
I think that's fair to say. But okay, if we took Israel out of the equation, if there was never, a Jewish homeland created in Palestine, I think there's no question there would be much less friction between Muslims and the West. Let's just put it that way. I think. But it might not stop entirely, because there are, let's be honest, there are certain strains of Islam, the Takfiris, especially Sunni extremists that do see the Christians as infidels that need to be fought. But I think there's no question, too, that they have received a big boost because of Israel. And Israel has actually worked to support them. That's the thing, is they actually see this to their advantage. They want to create. So you do find, them secretly coordinating with, for example, ISIS in Syria. Or
Al-Qaeda. Like, we know that what Mossad and the CIA did to bring the Al-Qaeda guys into, the U.S. for 9/11.
Okay. Yeah. Well, okay. Well, that's sort of another question, because I don't think they were. I don't think they were actually planning 9/11, but the idea was that they were going to infiltrate Al Qaeda. That's kind of let's set that aside.
Just watch the Tucker Carlson 9/11 series.
Okay. All right.
Well, I haven't watched all of it. I'm just saying, I'm just telling everybody, not you.
But there clearly are. I think there's no question about it that Israel has favored actually the Sunni extremists, and they've tried to they did what they could to undermine the moderates. For example, in this recent prisoner release, there is one particular Palestinian figure that is respected by both sides, and in many ways he's a moderate, unifying figure that he could really make peace and establish bring about the two-state solution from the Palestinian side. As Barghouti, I forget his first name. But they didn't release him because they don't want him out there. They don't want to have somebody they could really negotiate with. That's always been it. They actually go after the moderates. They kill them. They target the negotiators, and they try to support the radicals. That's been Israeli policy for a long, long time. So yeah, I think you can't say that there would be no friction. Clearly, there has been historical. There have been Muslim conquests of Christian lands. And then eventually the Reconquista, where of course the Spaniards eventually drove the Muslims out of Spain. So there has been real conflict historically, that long predates Palestine, but it certainly has exacerbated that. And there would be much less friction and much less, I think, hatred of hostility between Muslims and Christians. So many in especially Europe, are not really Christians, but just Westerners.
Yeah, it's just crazy to think about what the world would be like if the state of Israel wasn't created in 1948. Where would we all be? It would just be such a different world. It's impacted us so much. Yeah, and it is just such a crazy story. I just think there's no parallel in history. It's such a unique thing. But I guess a lot of just what we talk about, it's just about that the truth is coming out. It's just my own self-discovery talking to you about these things. And I know millions of people around the world are doing the same thing, just going down these different rabbit holes and just realizing that a lot of the problems stem from this one country. And as that realization comes into power, then we know that country's it's going to change somehow. It's either going to, just dissolve, or do you think, I don't think there's any belief that it can just change fundamentally, just the core, just everything from the creation to what it is now is just, It's a fake
Yeah.
state, you know. Like I know how upset that makes these
Yeah.
people, but it's just like, come on. I mean, yeah, I
Right.
hear these people. It's like you sound like you're from Brooklyn. What are you doing over here? You know, it's like,
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think that's the thing is that Zionism itself is fundamentally flawed. It was founded on the massive, on a massive ethnic cleansing campaign, the Nakba, and massacres. That's where we are. It's not like it just went bad at some point. It was fundamentally flawed from the beginning, and so yeah, it's hard to see how Israel would have to abandon Zionism, and that's just at present that just doesn't seem anywhere close to possible. I think you would find only a handful of people in Israel. I think probably know their names. That actually would accept that. It's so deeply, deeply. It's what Israel is, unfortunately.
well, yeah, I think we'll just be looking back at this history of Israel's existence with just like, whoa, that was an insane period. How did this happen?
Yeah,
But
yeah. No,
once
it is. I don't think it really has any precedent. I think that's completely true.
Well, a lot about what we talk about in the big picture thing is just about the movement away from U.S. hegemony to the multipolar world. But the multipolar world cannot exist with Israel, right? Because Israel is completely dependent on U.S. hegemony, right? So like these are one and side by side. And China has been making more stern statements, at least I see on X, about about Gaza, and Israel says that there needs to be, we need to persecute these violations, So I mean, as these countries like China and Russia grow increasingly more confident and are able to push their sway, we might see some more bumping up in regions like the Middle East, over things like Gaza. Right. I mean,
Yeah.
so like that's also just, we talk about just the change in the grassroots amongst the youth here on pivoting, turning away from Zionism. But the other reality is like, we're in a multipolar world now. And in a multipolar world, Israel's in trouble. Right.
Yeah, I think that's correct, right? They depend on Western hegemony, in particular American hegemony. That's what they, and then if once that falls, yeah, they're going to find themselves in a great deal of trouble. And you can see that process towards a multipolar world is taking place within the Middle East too. We've there it wasn't too long ago that there actually was a very firm alliance. We had Saudi Arabia, Israel, and the U.S. that were firmly aligned, against Iran. That was. But that has changed. It's not changed entirely. It's not that, but Saudi Arabia has gone from being just a very reliable part of that alliance to beginning, they're starting to hedge their bets. They see that there is a new order emerging. That they still haven't become a member of BRICS, but neither have they rejected the possibility. They're sitting on the fence, and that describes them in general. They're friendly with the Russians, they're friendly with the Chinese, and they have made peace with Iran, and that is a fundamental change from where they were. But they haven't, but they're still maintaining many of their connections with the hegemon. There's no question about it. But again, we do see that is. Maybe we have a long ways to go, but the process towards multipolarity, within the Middle East itself has begun.
I think I just am impatient because I feel like we're already in the multipolar world, and we're seeing it. We're seeing it with China stand up. We're seeing it in the Russia-Ukraine conflict. It's just clear to me that this is it. There are the U.S. more actually than just limits to the U.S. power. There's just extreme rot and weakness within the United States that has been exposed to me that I wasn't aware of until this conflict with Ukraine started. Then these things just started popping up, and I just feel like. To me, it's like if I'm ranking them, I am putting China, the U.S., down at the bottom amongst the three in terms of power now. We just have so many liabilities and weaknesses now. We're completely dependent on other countries for everything that are our enemies, that we have made our enemies. It's complete insanity. So Yeah, I just feel like
right.
I feel like we're already here, and I'm just wanting you to hurry up so that way people can stop dying because of the U.S. and its hegemonic thinking, you know?
Right. Yeah. Well, in a sense, like we said, that is the reality. We are entering into a multipolar world. It is happening. That is a trend. That's not going to be reversed, in spite of America's efforts to stop it, to impose these sanctions on China and so on. These are all to bring about the collapse of the Russian economy. They have failed. These were all attempts to reverse that trend. That trend is going forward, and it will continue to. And eventually, the reality will just have to be acknowledged by the West. There's some point where it'll just be ridiculous. But we're kind of like, again, to use the analogy of the Ukraine war. Yeah, it's clearly the Russians are winning, and the situation for the Ukrainians is increasingly dire. But you still get a lot of happy talk or wishful thinking in the West, because they can still spin it at a certain. But there will be a point, like we were saying, I think just in the last episode, where they can't spin it anymore. It just becomes ridiculous. The reality has to be acknowledged. So that's just the Ukraine war, but you can extend it to the whole globe and the trend towards multipolarity. Yeah, they work hard. We have very good spin machines, which is actually, I think actually it's overdeveloped. We're so good at it that we fool ourselves, and we can keep on pretending that things haven't changed when they will, but it's. Again, I know people use this often, but I think it is a great analogy. It's like Wile E. Coyote, where he goes off the end of the cliff and he's out in the air. We're kind of out there in the air right now, and we have our spin machines going. Everything's fine. We're not going to fall. But then the laws of physics kick in, and he drops, and that's what will happen to us.
Mm. Yeah, I wonder why we'll look back at this era of U.S. hegemony and also just this of Zionism and Israeli control over the United States and much of the Western world. China had its century of humiliation. Are we going to look back on this and be like, our 80 years of insanity?
It could be right.
It's a very unique, just crazy time we live in. It's hard for me to fully comprehend it. But you help with that. Thanks, Dan. Okay. Well, is there anything else you want to talk about, or should we just end it here?
I think that's enough for today. I think that's
okay. Fine. Okay, great. Okay. Well, have a good rest of your day, and I'll talk to you soon.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.